of the UNDP. And she sits on numerous nonprofit boards: Alliance for Affordable Internet, Access to Employment Canada, Yeni Shillong Museum of Arts, and the Junior Achievement, amongst many others. Welcome, Titi. And another lady on our panel, I'm so happy we have more and more ladies on the panel this afternoon, is Adeze Sokon. Adeze is the country director for the UK Nigeria Tech Hub. And just to give everyone background, if you didn't know, the UK Nigeria Tech Hub is responsible for supporting the growth of sustainable digital ecosystems in Nigeria through the development of high-end skills, supporting startup growth and development, and facilitating linkages and partnerships between the UK and Nigeria. She has over 6 years experience in Africa's tech ecosystem and has worked with different partners across government and agencies, including the Office of the President, of the President and Vice President, to provide advisory support and program design, as well as the international partners such as the European Union, World Bank, US Embassy, USAID, and private sector partners such as ARM, Google, Microsoft, and Facebook. Welcome, Adeze. Next, we have with us Benga Sesson, who is the Executive Director of Paradigm Initiative, a Pan-African social enterprise working on digital inclusion and digital rights through its offices in, quite a few offices across Africa, Cameroon, Kenya, Nigeria, Senegal, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. He is also a non-resident fellow at the Digital Civil Society Lab at Stanford University. And prior to starting the Paradigm Initiative, Benga led the Lagos Digital Village, a joint project with Junior Achievement of Nigeria, Microsoft, and the Lagos State Government. He originally trained as an electronic and electrical engineer at Obafemi Awolowo University, and has completed many executive programs at Lagos Business School, New York Group of Technology Transfer, Oxford University, Harvard University, amongst many others. Welcome, Benga. And on to our other last two panelists, we have Kazeem Sodangi. Kazeem was the immediate past acting national coordinator of the Office of the Nigerian Digital Innovation, and formerly the National Coordinator of the Office of Nigerian Content Development in ICT. He is also the head for investigations and enforcement team for the Nigerian Data Protection Regulation of the National Information Technology Development Agency. Kazeem is currently head of compliance at Smile Identity, and he is a graduate of civil law from the Ahmadu Bello University Zaria and has an LLM from on Information Technology Law and Intellectual Property from the University of Sussex. Welcome, Kazeem. And last, but definitely not the least, we have Chineye Mbanzoku, who is the founding managing director of the multi-award-winning technology solutions pioneer Infographics Nigeria. He has almost 30 years of an eclectic career in technology, software development, marketing communications, digital design, change, transformation, private and focused on education, health, and governance. He also worked at Microsoft as a general manager, Anglophone West Africa, as a member of the EMEA executive team. And after 2009, he went to pursue his vision of a borderless Africa as managing partner of Grand Central. He is the founding lead partner at Nine Consulting, a boutique enterprise development services firm that nurtures young entrepreneurs in its multinodal 9 Infinity hubs. Welcome, Uzo. And I'm gonna change my view so I can see everybody. And so let's get started, everyone. So as I said last week, the Nigerian Startup Bill is the sexiest piece of legislation undergoing circulation. It's meant to create an enabling environment for high growth technology enabled businesses, i.e. startups. So we all know that a law that harmonizes the different policies and helps startups to thrive is definitely what we need in Nigeria. Today, as we said, we'll be looking at how the policy and the policy environment affects the activities of startups. And you'll be wondering why the Nigerian Startup Bill is so important, but let's set some context here. African nations surprised the world how we got through our defense against COVID-19. We did suffer disproportionately from a parallel plague of the global economic depression, but that recession did not hit Africa's tech industry. In fact, countries adapting to the expanding digital universe created by COVID-19 and the technology ecosystems across the continent are actually booming. and global investors have noticed. And when we now drill down to Nigeria, Nigeria has the highest number of startups on the continent. And these startups are one, employing staff, two, paying taxes, purchasing products from across the local market. So startups are important to the economy. So surely this new segment needs the regulatory certainty. And with certainty, you have the clarity to plan and grow. So if we have the startups protected, we have the FDI inflows, we have an enabling environment for startups to thrive, we have transparency and fees and processes, so global investors are more comfortable with investing with the startups in this country. So Startup Acts, the question is, are Startup Acts the next form of policy innovation in Africa? Let's kick off with this session and get our panelists in here. So I'm going to ask you all this question, and so just give a point each. In your opinion, what are the common regulatory issues being faced by startups currently? And I'm going to start with ladies first because I'm always on that front. Adeza, would you like to give us your view on that?
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me here. Really excited to be talking about regulation and how government and the ecosystem can work together. I'll just give one point so that the rest of the panelists can also answer that question. I would say regulatory uncertainty. Basically, in the recent past, we've seen certain disruptions in the ecosystem. And just the fact that startups will wake up one morning and they're not sure what type of laws or regulations that the government has come up with, like the recent bans that we've seen in the space, can be very disruptive to business and discouraging to investors. So I would say one of the really key concerns for startups in the ecosystem is uncertainty with regulation.
Okay. TT, your thoughts on this point?
It's absolutely great to be here. Thank you. So yes, uncertainty. But if you actually look at what is currently in place, it's actually been able to even understand and navigate the plethora of laws that could potentially touch you in your quote and unquote starting phase or formative state as a startup. That is like trying to navigate, I will borrow from my heritage, Igbo Irumole, right? As the forest of 1,000 demons, and arriving and not knowing what the part is without the right guide.
Excellent. Do we have Benga, your thoughts on this?
Thanks, Yewande. So I think it's very clear that this wasn't the plan by startups. There's one reason why startups get moving. It's to innovate and create things and build things and return value to shareholders, not to deal with, this regulation and that regulation. And I think one of the major challenges is that many, startups consider this a burden. This is like extra work. And to be fair, in an environment that supports innovation, you shouldn't have to worry about having to understand some complexities. Of course, the bigger you grow, the more you do, you will have to get to understand these things. But from the work we do in many African countries, I think a lot of regulation is more of a distraction than an enabling set of rules for startups. So it becomes a distraction, and this wasn't what it planned for. But now they know they don't have a choice. You have to engage.
Well, they'd have to get there one day, right? Because as they get bigger, governance and regulatory compliance will become a thing. So at the beginning, you don't want to deal with it, but I guess they're just having to engage it a lot earlier because of our policy environment. Okay, and Chinaya, do we have you there? What are your thoughts on this? Chinaya?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, great. I think that I think there's a bit of a misunderstanding. The sense that when startups are involved when startups are trying to ideate and innovate, what they're doing is that they're focused on their product and they're focused on their business, right? And so without meaning to be negative in that sense, that isn't the business operates within an environment. And I think the first thing you need to do is to understand the regulatory environment which you're in. In many cases, they are innovating around spaces where there is no regulation. or possibly the existing regulation has not actually anticipated the startup. So literally, you're coming with something that is fresh. The environment isn't ready for you, and so you cannot meet with regulation that suits your purpose. So it's very important for the startups to come into this understanding that yes, you have to. The earlier you start the process of engaging with the regulatory space, the more stable the environment will be relative to you. It's not to say that it's perfect or it's ever really perfect, but you just have to engage. The challenge is it costs money and it costs time, and a startup doesn't have that. And so that's why we've been advocating in ISPON that this should be passed off to industry groups. So the industry groups engage on behalf of the whole and take on the cost that a startup cannot really bear in terms of time and in terms of money. But if you don't engage early around your issues, then you're going to meet up with problems down the line.
Thank you. That was really profound in terms of how you must know the regulatory environment in which you're creating a product. It might exist, it might not. Are they ready for you? Are they not? But you need to have some sort of awareness of that. And it does cost money and time to engage the regulator. I've been there. Don't let me talk about it. It gives me heebie-jeebies right now. And last but not least, Kazim, your thoughts on this point. What is one point, common regulatory issue being faced by startups currently?
Thank you, Yawande. It's fantastic to be in the session. I think my colleagues have mentioned and stated the key issues, but I'll just step it down a bit. I think there is even a definition problem. What is a startup, to the policymaker? What is innovation? What does it mean, innovation? How does it happen? We hear, maybe you talk about IBM and you say innovation, there's a sense of what that may mean, inventing stuff to go to space, probably. But you see, within the stakeholder groups we're trying to address and speak with, there's a huge definition problem. There isn't even an understanding, a proper understanding of when we throw these terms, startups, fundraise, Series A, what does it really mean? So there is, if the largest single task, which I think that the group has achieved somewhat, is education, right? Being able to just even elevate the thinking of those who are around policy, to have perspectives, even those who you imagine would understand really what this is about, are without context. So the elephant in the room for me, based on my insights of being around the public sector and the private sector, is that there's a huge definition problem and just the need to elevate thinking on what is in this market or globally, or what's going on. So I think that's for me the critical thought, in addition to things that have already been discussed.
Okay, so you've even gone even further. We don't even know who we're dealing with. We don't even know what's a startup. The regulator doesn't know what a startup. What's innovation? It's new. We're all defining it as we go along. So that leads to even different problems. Is it a company that's been in existence for 1 year that's just touched making grass out of plastic? Does that qualify you as a startup or an innovator? So it's very versatile. So I guess that's really clear. So I'm going to recap. 1, uncertainty. 2, it causes disruption. 3, a plethora of laws that people have to go through and decipher how it affects them and how they need to adjust themselves to be compliant. 4, it's the cost of being compliant and understanding the regulation. It takes time, and we need to have an industry approach to engaging the regulators. And 4, regulators don't know your definition. You don't know your definition. Nobody knows anybody's definition. So we're all confused as we go through this whole process. So moving along, TT, we're making a law, the startup bill. And we can all sit here and say, oh yeah, we got the startup bill and it's going to be passed into law. But let's act like nobody knows what that means, right? Let's take a step back. Can we educate everyone on the lawmaking process? Let's give everyone a step-by-step play to know how long this is. I mean, it's not going to be like overnight, wake up, I want to have a law and it happens. So let's give everybody that context. And then who is the apex regulatory body when it comes to making laws? So let's go through the step-by-step and who are the players. And all my beautiful panelists, my handsome and beautiful panelists, please, can I have your videos on? We want to see you. We want to feel you. Can I see you, please? Okay. I'll call out names in a minute. Okay, TT, over to you.
Thank you. I will tell you, I'm putting the video off and on because it almost feels like everything is a bit scratchy sometimes. But what's the apex body? That can be quite a complex question because it depends on the kind of law you're making, right? Are you aiming for an act? Are you making regulations in connection with an act? Are you being, I almost said something now, are you being a regulator and putting mandates or something else in place? So all of those actually, in one way or the other, defines who might be the institution that has the ultimate power, quote unquote. However, all of this derives, right, in an ideal situation, all of this would derive from an act of some sort, an empowering legislation that has been put through both the House of Assembly and the Senate in Nigeria's case, and that has been signed off by the executive, the president. But I believe Kasim will be able to speak more into this because he's been on the inside. But for us, from working externally, there are so many layers that in itself is a learning process. And to the point of the panelists earlier on, it is critical that in as much as you might not have the resources to be able to pay for the requisite skill set, that startups that want to play in this space, right, are able to take the time to learn what that process looks like and what would apply to them. I want to be able to see as well that the process is multi-layered. The process is built to enable collaboration and engagement, not just from lawmakers, so your legislators, etc., but also from the private sector and the public. But is that the case in reality? I think Binga is also here on the call. That is a different discussion I think we'll get to as well.
All right, Kazim, do you want to contribute towards this conversation from your experience having been on the inside?
I mean, Titi can sufficiently cover this field. I don't know why she passed on she's quite experienced, but the real—
It's good to have multiplicity of experiences, right?
Of course.
There are two sides.
So, I mean, you would, by looking at Nigeria's constitution, you would imagine that the National Assembly is the apex lawmaking body, right? But when it comes to dealing with, businesses, startup and innovation, you find out that, for instance, the regulators, like Titi has mentioned, are very powerful. They tend to regulate what people do with their money with circulars, unfortunately. And this we're now beginning to see another dimension to the story, which is we will increasingly see the courts as regulators, the courts as the law. It's a jurisprudential sort of perspective, but we're increasingly going to see the activism probably of the judiciary, possibly with this issue-based litigation. We will see that the judge, the court, has a role to play in determining what happens in a business environment. We saw the judgment recently stating that you can't regulate an industry by circulars, and we've seen tons of those. It is possible that a chunk of what we've seen in terms of regulation in Nigeria are illegal. In fact, I've long held the view that tons of what we do and what we did when I was also in government, a lot of it was bordering on illegality and sometimes even rascality, really. So, but again, the houses of assembly of states are critical in also the business, dealing with business premises, right? Other things that affect the day-to-day operations of businesses, innovators of small businesses, and then the unwritten laws and rules of, for instance, how are Yahoo boys viewed? And that spills over to the talent, actually, and how they operate. So it's a really complex web, of which will mean what we want to see. One of the things that we need to strive for is some order. We'll want to see an arrangement to know who is responsible for what and what actions. We don't expect that human beings from a political culture will all be aligned on day one or soon even. But we're beginning to see a terrain where there's a sensible understanding of what role you are playing. And then we begin to categorize and see if your role is on the whole detrimental to industries, innovation, and verticals. So I mean, that sort of begin to put a handle on this really confusing state, no pun intended, to where we are. I hope this is useful.
Yes, it is. And to just maybe just get back in to give balance is that in the design, in the makeup of a democratic governance system, this various aspect that Kasim has actually mentioned are put in place as forms of checks and balances so that there's not overt power lying either with the executive. And when I heard the question, what's the apex lawmaking body? That is correct. However, that apex lawmaking body does not have complete control. I think in our entire ecosystem as Nigeria, maybe as Africans, there's the need to have one person that has ultimate power. Governance is not designed to be that way. The judiciary is supposed to be able to put in checks and balances, right? The legislator is supposed to make laws. The executive is supposed to have its role. And that's the way it should be. However, what we have historically predominantly experienced is one where the judiciary has done what it needs to do, quote unquote, no matter how slowly. But the legislature and, the implementing arm of government has just gone, like you said, and that's it, bye-bye. And, that is the frustrating part, particularly for the private sector.
So I'm sorry, I've been smiling here. I've seen a comment from Benga saying confessions, pointing at Kazim, confessions of a policy hitman. When I wrote down the word rascality, I was just like, whoa, he went there. But you are right. I think it does lead to a lot of frustration in the ecosystem, because no matter how you're thinking this is how it should go, it isn't how it goes, right? It's almost like, let's plan for what isn't going to happen, what left turn is going to come in, what boulder is going to come out of nowhere, and that sort of thing. So yes, thank you for that. So I'm going to move right on along, because this multi-layered discussion is definitely going to continue throughout today's conversation. But Benga, seeing as you're smiling at me, I'm assuming, can you briefly identify key regulations and laws that have been passed in the last years and how they've affected startups? I know this is hot and contentious, because we've all mentioned this afternoon, how laws have come and circulars come to turn all around, but just mention a couple, like let's say 3 that you say that really affected startups positively, negatively. Let's not all just be negative and slam the regulator, but let's just see a couple that have come out.
For sure. Yeah, so ironically, the most significant impact on startups in the last year haven't been laws, actually. They've been policy somersaults. But that's, that's sort of quite negative. Let me look for the positive ones. One of the positive ones is, for example, the policy somersault of the CBN. So the CBN says everything crypto blockchain is banned, and then somehow reverses itself and begins to talk about a digital currency. What that does, and I don't think it was intended, but what that does is that it actually gives legitimacy to the startups that actually were doing things in this area and that were not understood by regulators and were being questioned. So I think that's a very, very important thing to note, that typically policy and regulation lag behind innovation. But when the policymaker then begins to take elements of what innovators are doing, maybe not exactly, of course, the digital currency is different from cryptocurrency, but the fact that there's a policy appreciation and even implementation of digital currency backed by the state, speaks a lot to not just appreciation, but even to some extent, some understanding of this. Some of the things that I believe would have a lot of it, well, of course, like Kasim said, we're allies in this, and even when we had conversations that were not public, when someone from civil society talks to someone from government and no one else should know, just so that we can advance the cause of the country. We've talked about things like the Nigeria Data Protection Regulation from NIDA, which is quite honestly a very problematic instrument of law, because it's secondary legislation. and it is not overseen by an agency of government that has the power required to manage data protection in the country. So here are startups being told by NIDA that you have to comply with certain things around data protection, but then you have this whole new conversation starting up again that there is a data protection bill being discussed. So I think some of the policy, reactions we've seen are good news in the sense that they, show various stages of grief. First of all, you ignore, then you sort of try to fight it, and then later you settle down and maybe even adopt the same thing in building some of your understanding that will help you in your work. So I think, there have been some developments that are positive, maybe not intended to be positive, but clearly positive, like the example of the CBN policy somersault. But clearly, what we need to pay a lot of attention to are the bills that are going through the National Assembly at the moment. Some of them stalled, but the way this thing works, you can wake up tomorrow and realize that this bill has passed if you didn't pay attention.
Yeah. Adeze, do you want to contribute towards this conversation?
Yes, just to add, I do agree with Benga that it was there are lots of policy somersault, not necessarily laws in the space. And I'll just mention too, I think previously the first attempts to try to galvanize the ecosystem to create policies was the Yaba Manifesto. And then I think championed then by CC Hub and a bunch of other ecosystem stakeholders based in Lagos. I think people got also busy because these guys were also founders trying to build their companies and programs and initiatives at the same time, trying to drive policy. But they did produce that document. And then a few years ago, there was also another attempt which produced the 9th document. It's called National ICT Information Entrepreneurship Vision, then championed by the Office for ICT Innovation and Entrepreneurship underneath that. And that also was the president endorsed this vision, and it was supposed to inform policy reforms and initiatives to protect investors and startups. But again, it didn't, it's just a document now on the shelf, right? But it did a good job of bringing different ecosystem players together. And I think now that we're talking about the bill, you would hear the ecosystem saying that with all of these policies and conversations and dialogues over the past 5 years, the concern is, will the bill, if passed, be another document on the shelf? Would it be implemented? Would it actually be laws that would be taken into effect? And that concern of apathy and issue of trust still remains a concern, even though there's excitement with the bill.
Okay. All right. Chineye, you wanted to add something? Saw your hand up.
Yeah, and I'm trying to be, I hope I'll be gentle when I say this, but in saying this.
Gentle.
Can you hear me? I'll try to be gentle,
yeah.
Right? So I think the startup ecosystem shot itself in the foot with this narrative that startups started in Yaba and YabaCon. And it's a big challenge because it also speaks to the disconnect that they have by disposition towards the existing system that was in place before. They didn't just appear in the space of nothing. There was already something in place. And if they had recognized that there was a past before them, they would have taken advantage of that past to try to build into the future. But the idea that they started in Yaba 5 years ago or 10 years ago is exactly what caused the initial problem. And so they continued within this cocoon of this narrative, thinking that they were creating something that had never been done before in an environment where there was nothing in place. And then they ran headlong into the reality that there were actually laws that were put in place. I mean, I'm the president of ISPON, which is the Institute of Software Practitioners of Nigeria. We've been in advocacy for 20 years plus. We were part of the people that created NIDA. We were part of the ones who created the Federal Ministry of what you now call the Federal Ministry of Communications and Digital Economy. These things emerged out of direct advocacy. I'm sure Wenga, despite his hair that's still on his head, will remember that we were at the National Assembly where a fight broke out amongst the ecosystem, which eventually led to the coalition, to the kind of like the convergence of technology associations and industry groupings with the Nigeria Computer Society. That was a fight over the cybercrime bill. Wing, I'm sure you remember that. And it was a fight with different voices. So you cannot have this, so long as it persists in this thinking that Yaba started it, and it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, they lose the advantage of the history. And it's not just dead history, it's active history. So I can tell you exactly why NIDDA was created the way that it is today. I can tell you, for instance, that we crafted it as a commission, and it was eventually passed as an agency. I can probably tell you the reasons why. And there are many people who are older than me who probably were, in the nitty-gritty of that fight. So again, it just circles back to what 2 points that were made earlier. The first is by Kasim when he said, what is a startup? A startup is not something that emerges out of somebody's voice quarter or some laptop somewhere. We had startups at our time 20 years ago. And startups will continue to come 20 years from now, when most of us are either gone or we've gone gray. Mwenga would have lost all his weight and he would have been looking like he would have gone really gray, become a grandfather in the room. But that's the first point, that defining the startup in our context, it's really just a technology company. And there are startups that have existed in the past and have gone through this cycle, but this new generation of startups refuse to recognize or even to learn from what had happened previously. Now, the second point is that if you do so, you have to always understand, and this is very, very important, there is no way that regulation can anticipate innovation and provide for it in a manner that would allow the innovator navigate freely. All over the world, we're still seeing this. We're seeing the battles going on between Facebook and Twitter, and everyone is constantly in every economy trying to deal with the realities that have emerged. And I think the great thing about what has happened with the NSB is that it has done it's like microwaved education, right? So we're suddenly all in this space together, and we're now talking across generations, we're talking across industries. We have seen this cross-group collaboration that is absolutely important, because you can't have, there are 41 million or 43 million MSMEs in Nigeria. 100,000 of them are SMEs. You cannot have 100,000 voices speaking into the regulatory space. There must be some way in which you can achieve some convergence. And the last point I want to make, so I can kind of give room, oxygen to other people, is that we've got a responsibility to educate the regulator. So these people that we expect to suddenly understand are still operating in spaces where they are barely digital. The majority of the people on that side of government, right, or that side of the table, are not digital first generation. They are not digitally literate in a manner which you expect them to be. So the conversations we want to have with them have, first of all, to identify a common language. And after that common language, we now have to educate. And after that education, we can then have the kind of collaboration. And I think that's happening really quickly. We're moving something uphill and we're fixing the car as we're going along. And I think we're doing a great job. And I really want to give a lot of congratulations to the ecosystem itself, because they've learned and they've moved really quickly, which is really one of the really, really amazing things about Gen Z and the millennials. They're agile, they're adaptable, they see what's happening, they're making the connections and making the corrections. The future is just absolutely brilliant. Let's engage.
So just going to recap that, because I took a couple of points from everybody on that. So Adesa was like, okay, this thing started about a couple of years ago in Yaba, and then Chinenye says, nope. We were way before the Yaba generation, dude. Those of us that, like, let me give him a soft look. Those without any hair certainly saw the first leg. It goes away, and I think that's what we haven't stopped. Sometimes we don't do that. Someone comes in, I'm young and I'm new and I'm Gen Z, I'm millennial and I'm the first. But the computer didn't start with this generation, right? So there must have been something in the past. And sometimes we don't take that step back to look, what are the existing policies that exist? And Nigeria, let me tell you, I never knew, even let's take away from the tech. You think, oh, there's no social services in Nigeria. There's laws for children walking on the streets. You shouldn't have them. They're supposed to be picked up. There's a law, everything. Like Nigeria has laws in abundance, policies in abundance. Enforcement and application, we can talk about that another time, but it's not that laws and things, and this is what we need. I'm hoping, and this is what I'm going to challenge the panel and say, is this startup bill going to bring, taking a time to look at the existing policies, look at the existing laws, and see how we harmonize them under this umbrella of the startup bill, as opposed to saying this is enough. And so we don't have what Adeza said. We do not want the startup bill to be another policy that sits on a shelf. So taking Chineye's point, taking Benga's point, taking Adeza's point, step back. Are you making sure all the existing, and there are numerous, and different agencies have their own policies. By the time you're looking at telco, by the time you're looking at financial services, by the time you're looking at, if it's an agricultural product touching on telco services, you know, it's crossing agri policy versus telco policy and all of that. Are we looking at this holistically to make sure that the startup bill is going to resolve these issues that you guys have raised? And I'm going to take that to our old converted regulator, Kazim, to tell us what he thinks about that, because he's been flipping from side to side and I like it. So are we making sure this new startup bill addresses these three issues that Adeze, Benga, and Chineye has mentioned, that there were policies existing? We need to make sure we're touching all of that in the new startup bill in solving these regulatory issues.
It's a very good question. It's a very good question. I usually, like 2 days ago, and often when I speak about the bill, I start with the anticlimax. I say that it's not a very ambitious bill. It doesn't try to make us a startup nation, but it's a very important bill. The most critical component of that bill, in my view, is the council. If we get the human beings, because we're dealing with a situation where there's a challenge with coherence. There are no complementary actions. There's a challenge with even just policy making and strategic policy alignment and things that usually will reflect in other sort of midterm expenditure framework to just show that policy ideas cascade into how the government puts its money where its mouth is. So what we want to achieve, and honestly, this bill, before I go on with that thought, this bill doesn't even try to put startups. I also say in some, in business, they'll say cash flow positive. It's just to leave startups and innovators almost at neutral so that they can continue to do what they do. Not to put that ecosystem in negative. Because what we see is that where there are incoherent policies, there are ideas that are incoherent, not well thought out, or they're sort of fiefdoms and empires being built, or castles that are independent, just ideas, whimsical ideas of human beings. What really happens is that you have an industry that is even just trying to survive, just human beings trying to even just stay in a room and work. So what this bill does with the council is just align critical players to sit on a desk or be represented in a forum or series of fora that speak to the issues and say, listen, you have a policy on X. How does it help X or Y? So what the bill tries to do is policy alignment in the first place before some of the other overt things that will be done to stimulate, to enable, to. The key thing is just saying, what are we doing? We want to have, and if this is where, either through the work of civil society or well-meaning Nigerians or people who think about it and ship industry are able to present just facts and figures and ideas in a sensible manner and say, look, we need to be consistent and to be true and understand that if we will be competitive. I've been in certain rooms, and one of the things that as one who was on the policy making side, it doesn't baffle me. It amuses me that people sometimes in the private sector just assume that there's a lot of information in government, and they should know these things. They should know we will be competitive. We should be competitive by Africa Free Trade Continental Area Agreement. They should know this is where the world is going with data. They should know all this. They should have known. It's gist, right? The government is good at many things, but there are these asymmetries. The information asymmetries are just huge. I mean, this is not the forum to talk about just those gaps. But the point is that if we can engender policy alignment and just the conversations about being able to see the space through series of frames that are presented to the same stakeholders, then we would have achieved significantly, what that bill intends to, one of the key components of that bill. So I'll say to you simply that policy alignment is at the core of certain sections of that bill, and that is what we want to achieve with it.
I think that's some major, so it addresses what Chineye mentioned in terms of there were policies before. We've sat down to make sure how do these policies all align underneath, and that's what these policies exist. Now we just have to make them align to make sense in the current context in which we're applying them. I'm going to move back to Chineye. So how, as a private sector chap, how can the private sector organizations collaborate with the regulators? Because you mentioned that we need to educate the regulators. So how can we collaborate with the regulators to ensure they're making an enabling environment for startups? Because you can look at the Kenyan model, and someone mentioned this earlier, that a regulator can't anticipate innovation, so they just will make laws and pick from different countries and then apply it sometimes. But there are markets where they decide test and learn, and I'm a believer in that. That's my thing. Don't over-regulate. Allow the market to start working and then develop. This is my personal opinion. Everybody putting my hands up. Yowande's personal opinion. Allow the market to evolve and then start creating laws to ensure protection of the ecosystem. But you tell me, how do we educate the regulator? Don't come with the sledgehammer, get from India, get from Canada, get from Spain, get from South America, and then create the most cumbersome law known to man and apply it in a country not going to see half of the things they're talking about. So how do you think the private sector collaborate with them, with the regulator?
Right. So to answer that, and it's another superb question. I don't know where your questions are coming from. Who's the guy? There's must be some lady behind you feeding you stuff. This is just incredible. This is, the answers just come like shotguns. So let me try to catch up. I think Titi made a great point, and so did Adeze, around kind of like contextualizing what we're trying to do with this Nigeria Startup Bill. And there was a piece that was not mentioned, and that's the role of the citizen. Because we look at government as the executive, we look at the legislature for creating those bills, and then we jump to business as institutions, as kind of like organizations within the ecosystem. But you see, the pressure that goes to government and to legislature has to come from the action of the citizens. And in many ways, the Nigerian citizenry is disengaged from that entire policy-making, law-making type of process. Things just happen. In many ways, we tend to kind of like create businesses and operate our businesses as though we would deal with whatever they throw at us, rather than being constructive in terms of engaging. I doubt, and we're finding as we go out into the town hall process, which is why the NSB is very important. I've said before that I think is groundbreaking. Having been in advocacy for quite a while, I can say quite clearly, and I think some of my colleagues will probably agree, that the NSB is really groundbreaking in the sense that it's taken this big tent approach and is very collaborative, and it's cross-group. So people are talking and sorting out their issues in the manner that they really ought to before it gets into a crisis. But our default environment and our social and political context is that things just happen. So somebody takes a paper, goes to somebody who is influential in government, and goes to a legislator, constructs something that is supposed to be a bill, supports it through a process, and we just hear it one day. Like Benga said, you just wake up and suddenly somebody has announced something. But the question was, there was a gap, and we didn't occupy that gap. Even with Central Bank of Nigeria, active engagement as industry around crypto, in terms of working together, not one person going to go and visit his friend in the central bank, but at an industry level, an active engagement and very early engagement with the central bank around crypto, and not just CBN, SEC and all the others, could perhaps have created a friendlier environment for the regulation, and maybe there would have been discussions before the sledgehammer landed. This is like where our organizations are behaving like our citizens. We are sitting detached from the system and saying, well, things are just going to, whatever they do, we'll ride the storm. And then you turn around later on and say something is wrong. And I'm not defending government. I'm just simply saying we have a bigger role. And I really think that we have to look to ourselves for the change and drive through. And when we get to the point where we've got a challenge, we then say, okay, well, these guys are not cooperating. The second point I want to make there is that, again, as the NSB is showing, over time, just by attrition, natural attrition, we don't have a digital-oriented or digital-first generation on the other side of government. Predominantly, what you find is that people who go into enterprise in the private sector are very different from those who go into the civil service and civil service related type of organizations. So right there and then there's a challenge in terms of the conversation. Again, what should be the role of the private sector? I think private sector needs to be actively engaged. And we did this, and sorry to kind of like beat our chest, once again, but years ago, for instance, they didn't have technology procurement within within government was handled in similar way that it was handled in the private sector as a cost center. And it sat under this office called the DPRS, right? Director of Planning, Research and Statistics. And it was overseen by the finance function inside the ministry. It took us as industry to advocate for the creation of an IT cadre in government, which means that you can graduate from a university or any institution and plan an entire career within the civil service, rising to a level of level 17. Without making that policy change, you would never have professionals in government in the technology space. And so there's nobody for you to talk to across the table when you meet. So that simple change created the departments and created the roles of CIOs within government. And that's a similar kind of thing that you have to see proliferating in the course of digital transformation, so that when we are going to them as technology experts or technology players, there is somebody on the other side. So the private sector can then see, Wenga would see, or Adeze would see somebody that she went to school with, and that person is sitting across the table from her. Same kind of thinking, same direction, and that's what the attrition will happen. So I think 10 years from now, the conversation will be completely different, because there will be a lot of people who are private sector players working in government, people like Kazim. So you can have a conversation with him because he's a private sector guy who went into the public sector. And we have a lot of thanks to give to people like him who have done that, because it isn't easy to sit in those spaces and work within the constraints of government. But because they're there, people like Oswald in the presidency, because they're there, the connection can be made and the conversations can be had, and they can help us navigate. So in summary, just three things. One, government, private sector needs to be proactive in terms of engaging. Secondly, private sector needs to be clear about building relationships and long-term relationships within the government, where that education then passes forth, even in some cases, seconding people from the private sector to work in government and support the government and the regulators to understand the private sector perspective. And then third, I just guess it's just a matter of time. Very soon, we will vacate the space, and it's going to be our children's children who will take over, and they will definitely be digitally first, and the fight will be a completely different fight.
The digital first conversations, you can't have that sort of conversation if the person across the table from you thinks you're speaking Japanese, right? So the more of us that have been in the private sector that move in the public sector, the conversations will be easier, because like is with talking to like, and we're understanding, we're not bringing out a dictionary translator or having someone come in as a bunch of consultants working with the government that are going to come and go, right? It's nice to have someone sitting in that policy space who can talk to you. But another thing I'm still taking home is that the industry too cannot be complacent. You said one thing, that they just said, whatever is going to happen is going to happen. And that is a problem in and of itself, because when the policy now comes, you're like, yay, did they put that there? And you're like, well, you didn't tell them anything. It went up, it got approved, it got signed, it's now law. Then you're trying to reverse it. It becomes, it's a mission impossible situation. So thank you for that, Chinaya. So I'm going to bring on Titi, who's been quiet for a minute. So we've all had, because I didn't want to put Kazim on the spot again, because it's going to be a bit of a regulator bashing moment. So Titi, let us share some experiences in terms of when there've been conflicting regulations created by different regulators. I think we've all touched on it because it hits a nerve. So just give an example or two where you've seen conflicting regulations coming out from different regulators in our market. Titi, are you there? I don't want to put Kazim on the spot, but I will. But if not, Adeze, do you want to mention a couple of policies that came out?
Hey,
I'm going to go.
Okay.
Oh, who's? Okay, go ahead. Go ahead. Okay, I'm losing everybody on my screen. Benga, do you want to give me one? Because I know you've got the history of the regulations coming out and giving us heart. Kazim, I'm trying not to put you on the spot, but I'll bring you in. But Benga, give me a couple.
So of contradictory laws, right? Let me give one recent example, very, very funny example, the CBN and the SEC on cryptocurrency. So the SEC says, well, it's an asset class, and then the CBN says it's illegal. And I can tell you clearly, Kasim said earlier that, we're partners in progress, not in crime. One of the reasons why this happens a lot is because the different arms of government don't like talking to each other. Everybody is trying to control their turf. And I've said this, one of the reasons why we have a confused data protection regime in Nigeria is because some smart agency went ahead to do it for themselves while others were trying to get things done. So this is the reason why we have one agency going in this direction, another agency going in that direction before they then talk to each other. We have a presidential committee, for example, on data harmonization. And as I speak to you, everyone on this call and those who are not on this call have done at least 6 biometric registrations with different government agencies. And this is why these things happen. And I think this is why one of the things that I love is the fact that, yes, I'm in civil society, but there are folks on the inside that we have off the record conversations, right? Kazim will probably remember one of those conversations we had about data protection in Nigeria. There was a lot going on. I mean, I was in South Africa. I don't remember where it was, and he called and it was like, guy, we need to do something now. And we need to talk across silos, because at times the people who are policymakers, who are in government, even need us to make some noise and push a few things so that they on the inside can then make the case to other folks within the system who are not aligned with what will help to make progress. And I just wanted to add one quick thing on this, not direct response to your question, Yewande, but I've heard a number of us say today that, and I've said it myself, that policy always lags behind innovation. But I think that has literally now become an excuse for many governments. Serious governments have now decided to become startup nations, such that you don't even wait for innovation to happen. You begin to ask yourselves, you begin to go out of your way to talk to younger people, to talk to old people who are working on stuff, to say, what are the new things you're working on? So that we can then begin to think very creatively on possible policy support, not rundowns, obviously.
So, Kazim, I'm going to put you on the spot. Executive Orders 3 and 5 are supposed to support local content, but we sort of think they don't. So do you want to speak to that? This is, again, this whole regulatory, are we on this side, are we on that side argument that we're having this afternoon. So tell us a bit more, and maybe explain to the audience what Executive Orders 3 and 5 are and why they are conflicting in terms of supporting local content.
So very interesting question, and one I had to deal with in my former life a lot. And I'm happy to share this experience because we need to learn from it. The Executive Orders 003 was issued to support local content. It was issued with the best intentions, I assume. It did consider what could happen, if we support local content. 005 summarily was issued to support the implementation and the development, design, and implementation of science and technology projects around the federal government and the federal government spend. The challenge with those two pieces of directives or policy, or whatever they were, was that what are they really in the first place? What is an executive order really within the scope and the structure, and how is it supposed to operate? Are they policy instruments, which I thought they would be? Then they would need to be reflected either in some strategic plan, like the EGP and the EG, what's it called? The growth recovery plan, of the federal government, which was like the development plan. The thing about government is that once there isn't policy coherence, if it doesn't feed into like a mid to long-term development plan, then cascades to what is called an MTEF, a midterm expenditure framework. then cascades into budgets and implementations, it is just hot air. They're nice ideas, but they were left hanging. And so they were not, you could not translate them into tangible policy, regulatory, and strategic documents that were implemented. They were great ideas, as in that sense. But the product construct of how things are delivered and sustained in government. So one of the challenges, including what Benga has mentioned, is that when we think about policies and ideas and we have them in fits and starts, if they do not come together as a body of work that will cascade into actionable plans, fancy have interesting policies, and seeking the input of experts and the industry, and you do the grounds up thing that we've tried to do with the Nigerian Startup Bill, then you will have a policy which is composite. But when you need to atomize and implement, there's a huge problem. Take 003, for instance. When you say local content in the tech space, what do you mean? How would you implement it for software as a service, for instance? What do you mean for routers? If you say all hardware would have 40%, do you mean, and I've seen this interpretation, civil servants come and say, 40% means that the human beings who are installing are local, right? The software can be from anywhere. When you leave regulation or documents like that to amorphous and meaningless interpretations, then it just becomes unimplementable. I mean, with all sense of respect to those who have crafted these documents. But I think that one, there's need for broad coherence and think about what are the strategies for implementing these whole ideas? Then secondly, grounds up, what does it really mean in terms of spend, implementation, measurement, capacities to be able to drive these? I look at the document, for instance, for Executive Order 006, and I say that if we probably implement it, the complete spirit of 006, the entire country will fail, because it doesn't take in a nuanced view, in my view, into expertise, transfer or learning of knowledge, bridging periods, a number of things that from experience will mean that we're still learning, where we are building capacities over a period. So I think that these strategies themselves and big policy statements are not the issue at all. They are great, but we really need to think about how these policy ideas will be implemented. Don't even forget that, Benga did mention the crypto and the second CBN situation, for instance. CBN's initial circular, the way they do the business of regulation, was a neutral stand on cryptos. That was even the initial position, right? So sometimes it's just this being able to think through and say to myself, exactly, I want to do an ENIR. What does it mean for the Nigerian innovation community? What does it mean for insights and capacities? What does it mean for budgets and implementation? These type of frames are, in my view, what the biggest deficits are around big, whole, nice, or nice-ish, I'll correct myself, policy ideas that then suffer when it comes to implementation. Then we can begin to correct, because when we do that, we can then correct the kind of structures and institutions, some of those things that Benga alluded to. Thankfully, Benga has testified that during my days in government, I did engage very broadly, because again, that's something that our regulators will need to learn. I did learn a lot from Chineye, from Benga, a number of people in this room. I would ask them questions. I could use my computer, but nothing close to a techie, but I had to ask tons of questions to get context. I think that is something our regulators need to learn systemically so that we can also move forward. Speak to the guys who run the thing, or else it just be a shot in the dark. Yeah.
So just recapping, and even just taking why these policy flip-flops, we started off by Benga saying the regulators don't talk to themselves. So we've established that, right? They have an attitude, I'm not talking to you, I'm not talking to you. So everybody's creating a policy that doesn't connect. Then we move back to what Kazima said in terms of you've got to engage broadly, then everything's going to make sense. And then even go from the bottom up. and then get to the top of what this policy is going to look like. And it has to also check, if I have this policy, can anybody action it? So take it to someone who's going to implement it and say, okay, if I create this policy for you, what are you going to do with it? And I think that sometimes gets left, I don't know, on the side, because like we said, that broad reaching engagement from all stakeholders, bottom to the top, small, whatever we're saying a startup is, to the one that's a bit more established, to the ones that are corporates, that can everybody in the ecosystem use this policy and work with it? And if we're not doing that, we're going to keep going back to this is where there's going to be the policy flip of edit to, let's retract, edit someone, and even that whole process. When it's up, I've had experiences where what the working group sent up to be approved came down looking totally different. So you're like, oh, how did that happen? Because again, we said there's other parties commenting in isolation of everybody else that's all talking together and being transparent. The more transparent we are and talking at the same time, the more it's all going to look the same. It'll meet my needs, it'll meet your needs, we'll meet everybody's needs, and we move forward. But when someone now comes from behind, I'm best friends with the central bank governor or whoever, and says this is what I need that point to put in to protect myself. And we know this happens, that protectionist effect on policies as well. And it's not just local, it does happen internationally as well. But I just think we've all agreed on this platform that broad-ranging engagement by regulators, and they need to learn between themselves with the players what they're creating policies on. So we've run so far out of time, but we're going to get 2 more points in that we just need to discuss, and then we're going to try and sneak in a couple of questions from the audience. So real quick, let me see which ones I'm going to take here. The regulation. And last week we talked about VC capital coming in to support startups. So I want to talk, how does regulation now impact capital, the investment in infrastructure, in terms of talent, in terms of, like we talked about just now, the local content drive? If the policy doesn't speak to all of those things in terms of, if I invest in this country, is my investment protected? How does this affect the ecosystem in the context of startups? Adeza, let's hear from you, because you're representing people investing in this market. So how did the policy environment affect investment and affect capital infrastructure and growing the local content?
Yeah, if the policies are favorable and certain, it's very attractive. It calls on different stakeholders around the world to want to invest. It even retains talent. We're seeing a lot of brain drain currently, not just of software engineers, but also even startup companies setting up shop in other countries, right? And as much as we're proud of the companies that we're forming, we need to know that the only way we can get value from these companies is if they set up shop in Nigeria. And so and when that's happening, it's lots of jobs are limited, taxes are not being paid, and the economy is not growing as it should. So when we had all this disruptive regulation, I could tell you lots of there were concerns in the international community. I mean, you still had some risk takers who were very optimistic in the country and were still investing, but a good number of people, especially those who were trying to understand the climate just for those disruptive regulations, were discouraged. You have companies setting up having registering their businesses in other countries, again, because the business environment is not attractive enough. So regulation is really key. It's a pillar of the ecosystem. And when it's not as attractive, there's brain flights. It's discouraging to investors. Talent are disappearing. And the only way to attract them back is to create that business environment that's attractive.
Okay. That's, if it isn't attractive and there's an easier market where you can invest and make your money, why bother, right? Although we always say that the key markets that are despite our challenges, Nigeria, Kenya, Egypt, despite every crazy thing that's going on in those 3 markets, people are still going there because there is a market, right? So people, like you said, there are the risk takers that will still bank on Nigeria despite everything that's going on here. But we do hope that the startup and other policies in the works will help us create an enabling environment for investors, a transparent environment, give that clarity. I've got my business plan. This is what I want to do. So I'm going to touch on a thing that always tickles me whenever, oh, Chinaya, please speak.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a quick point around add to what Adeza said, in terms of this capital. So it's interesting for us to understand that we kind of like tend to import these models, right? So we're bringing Silicon Valley, we want to drop the Silicon Valley model or drape it over Nigeria, and it just is not going to work. But if you understand contextually, the Silicon Valley and other ecosystems, how they've evolved, then ours would also be the same. We can learn from it, but it will never be exactly the same. And one good example, for instance, is that, VC funding, startup funding, startup capital it's high risk. And it requires a certain amount of knowledge in the space, not just of the country itself, but even how to invest in tech companies. We don't have that knowledge. And we haven't developed it because funding hadn't come into those companies up until maybe 5 years ago. The great thing about the Yaba story and things that came out of that is that they started to make that connection with international capital and bringing in international capital as organizations and institutions into our markets. So our HNIs have to learn how to invest in technology, and they would only learn from that FDI that comes in from organizations like what Adeza is doing and others similar to that. So now we know this is what Y Combinator does. This is what SeedStars does, and et cetera, et cetera. And so we start to learn from that. And then you can see HNIs coming into the picture. A second contextual issue is that we don't have capital broadly distributed in Nigeria the way it is in other countries. So in essence, we've got statistics that already shows us that, I think yesterday, there was some story about 97% of the bank accounts in Nigeria holding less than 500,000 naira. So that means that this whole talk about inclusion is really at the bottom of the pyramid. So there are going to be a few people. If you take that number and you look at AMCON has like 5 trillion in debts. And the 5 trillion in debts, 80% of that is held by 35 companies. So there's a huge concentration of capital in a very small percentage of our population. So funding into the ecosystem is going to come by trickles. The last element is where I think government has a lot to do. There is a sense, and many countries historically have actually done things that are equivalent to amnesties. So if you want funds to come into your country, and it is local funds to come into your country, I don't want to give money tomorrow, and then tomorrow and day after tomorrow, all kinds of government agencies come trooping to my office. If I announce that I have raised a company, I'm part of a capital raise, and that's 10 million naira or 200 million. I mean, even a young man who won Big Brother last year, the first tweets that came out were watch out for FIRS, right? So if I'm going to bring out my funding and put into startups, I don't want to be dogged by government. If government really wants to create startup capital funding, local capital, it needs to ring fence it and allow like almost like an amnesty type funding to come into that space. No questions asked. Money comes in, it goes into innovation, and it funds businesses that are fundamentally high risk. So we need to create that if you want private capital to come into it, local private capital to come in. Until then, let's open the doors to as many of the foreigners as can come.
But have we in this bill put that point there, some point to encourage local investors, local, that sort of tax holiday for HNIs, or I'm asking, Benga's raising his hand. So Benga, go ahead.
Yeah, we don't need to put that in the bill, basically. And the reason I say that is that investment is not legislated, investment is encouraged. By the time you see a few exits and you see a few unicorns, no one needs to tell you where to put your money. I think the challenge we had before now was there was old money in Nigeria looking at this young men and women, like, what do they think they're doing? But I think the story is a bit different right now. And we're even beginning to see, reinvested, funds from people who already have investments from outside and from inside, reinvesting some of their earned wealth in new startups, because everyone knows that you need just one winning idea for you to retire early. But if you can have a few, why not? So I necessarily don't think that we need to include any encouragement for investment in the bill. It's something that definitely speaks for itself.
Okay. So before I go to our last final points, let's take a few questions from the audience on what we've been discussing this afternoon, and it's moving so fast. There we go. Let's start. Okay, we all mentioned documents in the shelf from previous policies. So we have a question. Why can't all documents on the shelf be checked properly before creating new ones? Who would like to take that? I don't want to point to the ex-regulator, but it's tempting to do so. Okay, Adeze, you go ahead.
Yeah, I can answer that very quickly, and I'll answer that in the context of the bill. So before even I became country director, I used to lead the secretariat for the bill, and I would say that one of the first considerations was this same point, to not repeat the same mistake, to learn from history, right? So the first task for the drafters of the bill was to identify existing policies. So those policies on the shelves, whether they were in the corners of associations or in different MDAs, to identify and harmonize them into what they then produce as a legal framework. And they produced this legal framework listing out all the different policies and laws that were existing and circulated it to validate that covers, all the key points before the first draft was developed. So I do definitely agree with you that that's actually the ideal thing to do. And that was actually considered in developing this bill.
Okay, great. I'm going to go to another question real quick. And I think I know the answer, but I'm going to let you guys answer this. So apart from the popular agri-tech, fintech, telco, edutech startups that we have currently, there are a novel set of startups in the sector that we've not heard of in Nigeria. Machine learning in fashion design, auto tech is on the rise, electrical tricycles, and tracking, surveillance, and that sort of thing. Are these novel sectors also covered by the startup bill? So you guys answer that question. I don't want to assume I know the answer. No, Adeze, put your hand down, girl. You just answered a question. Kazim, answer that question for me.
Okay, even though Adeze would have been best pleased to, but I mean, because she did, this was one of the big issues she had as a person to ensure that the bill was all encompassing. Yeah, all encompassing. So what we did, I'll say that some of the behind the scenes action, right? We had to find a balance between being able to create something new that was needed and also but ensure that it was broad enough to have anyone. And I mean, all these areas that I identified play. Because we found out that if we created a bill in the flavor of some of the startup bills that were created in Tunisia, and we already had somewhat of that type of law in existence with the Smedan Act. But you see, it was an act written in a different time for a different purpose. And I will not go into the merit of that act. So what we did was to try and, to add that, if you like, suffix or prefix of tech-enabled. So anything at all that means that a company is structured in a particular way, and it means that it has a product that is considering tech or innovation as a central way of designing and delivering product, is adequately covered in the bill. I mean, there are questions about biotech, there were questions, but I think that without having to lose the opportunity to craft the bill, we're able to come up with the interpretable definition that allows for all these areas and even more of these areas. I mean, if you take what AI is doing around, for instance, arts, and you will see that you now are doing not even NFTs, which is, but just even the creation of artistry itself, you'll see that if you read it from a certain perspective, we have sort of created, that enabler. I would add also that in the bill, what we try to do, that some of the tax provisions in the bill and incentives that are in the bill today, we're not really done thinking about how the global or those VCs outside Nigeria investing in Nigeria are structured really. We're thinking about local capital, also seeing if there are ways to de-risk local capital from our angels, accelerators, and local VCs who would have to raise money locally, right? And work with other regulatory sort of concerns or rules, because a lot of the guys who come with foreign capital commit their capital to companies in Delaware, send salaries to be paid here, get paid, even abroad, and will continue to be, if you like, not profitable locally, in that sense. And, tax incentives are nice idea, So they're covered in the sense that we try to deal with policy, but we'll also deal with there's capital that can be entirely local, and then try and throw in the sweeteners. But yes, that's from the perspective of tax and taxation. But like Benga rightly said, it is the climate, the ideas, the posturing, and sort of the policies when and properly implemented that will incentivize, investments in the Nigerian startup scene.
You're
on mute. Okay.
My bad. I was just saying, Adese, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think it was well said. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Great. We're so far, time is far spent. We could be here all afternoon. I'm thoroughly enjoying this conversation. This is why I love these conversations we're having weekly and regards the learning series with the Nigerian startup bill. But let's just end this now. Each panelist, this is it. One last comment. Think about it carefully and please be nice. If you could say one thing to the regulator, what would it be? I'm going to start with Adeze, ladies first. One thing to the regulator, what would it be?
I would say that we should see this process of creating regulation as a business contract. Everybody has incentives, right? So the government wants to protect the consumer and at the same time promote economic growth and innovation. Startups want an enabling environment. Let's see it as a business contract. And the contract would be this bill or the act or any other policy that needs to be created. And just like every other contract, you don't negotiate in isolation. Both parties have to come to the table and negotiate what would be a win-win for everyone, including citizens who want access to opportunities globally, access to quality education, which tech can provide. So everybody needs to come to the table and negotiate. And also, just like every other contract, there's trust, meaning that for everyone who said they were going to do something in that contract needs to do it. So if the government puts policies, they need to implement it. If the policies that their startups needs to comply, everyone needs to comply. So it's not just government alone, it's everybody being held responsible for the laws of that contract. So I would say, let's see it as a contract. Let's be open-minded in negotiating the terms, and with every contract, there's trust. Thank you.
Great. Okay, Benga, over to you.
Thank you. So I'll say to regulators to stop waiting for things to be pushed to them. They can also pull stuff. There's a huge gap for leadership, not just on the African continent, but across the world, for smart regulators that deliberately go all out to plant members of their team within startup communities. They don't wait in Abuja for everyone to bring paper to them. They send people out. They become activist regulators. They become smart regulators. They go to find out. Even before things bloom, they're like, what's going on, guys? What is going on? And then they begin to build policy around that. What you will do as a regulator, if any regulator does that in Nigeria, what happens is you become like a NAFDAC. Suddenly everybody is like, oh my God, they're so effective. And then there's some good stuff in there for whoever is the head of that regulatory agency. The person becomes like a Dora, literally immortal, and then will praise you. So if you need some ego boost, do the right job and you will get praised.
Activist regulators, that's the new term we're taking home this afternoon. Kazim, and your thoughts? One thing to say to the regulator as a former person on that side. I'm not going to call you a regulator.
So again, because you've managed and Benga to put me on that side, I'll say I'll rephrase it a bit. What should we keep saying to regulators? I think beyond the process, what happens after the process is really critical. My view is that evidence-based policy making. In my view, we must learn how to communicate with regulators a bit more with evidence, with facts, evidence, and let them know comparatively where the world is going. As a former regulator, there's a huge problem, comparative knowledge, and then competitiveness. We must always put comparative knowledge and competitiveness before regulators. I said, this is what is going on, guys. This is where you are. Sometimes being able to speak to regulators in those small rooms, not in, I keep saying that we must learn policy small tables. The big rooms are jamborees, lots of times. They hear you, but you're drowned out as white noise. We must be able to sit down regulators consistently, even after this, and say, this is where we are. This is where we need to be going. That is, educating and elevating the thinking of regulators is a task that we can't relent. Sorry for flipping it in that way, but hey, I was a regulator.
No, evidence-based policy making and comparative knowledge, and also demonstrating competitiveness. Whether they're going to listen to that, we'll see, but definitely evidence-based knowledge policy making is very important. And last but not the least, Chinaya, your thoughts. One thing you want to say to the regulator, what would it be?
So I'm going to throw it back to you. I'm going to throw a whole bunch of stuff at you, and then you pick the one thing. Is that okay?
All right, then be that way.
Please indulge me. Please indulge me. So, and the reason why I come at it from that perspective is that it isn't just the regulator. First of all, okay, so if I wanted to say to what I think the regulators need to do is driven by the larger environment, right? They're working, when we talk about regulators, it's not some monolith that has the same DNA all the way through. What is happening is that they're operating within a complex structure of government that tends to be very hierarchical and very siloed. And so it's hard to say to one regulator. If I were to speak to one regulator, it would be government as a whole. And that would be that government should embrace the steps that we've taken as NSB to create those big tents, to have those conversations on an ongoing basis around all the issues. They need to get to a place where they're more open and more transparent, where we don't have things hidden in drawers, where we see the data, where we can actually discuss in an open way, in the same way which we've done around the NSP, to be able to create these new policies. So I don't know how you're going to put that into one word, but I come back to one last point on that, which is related, which is that it's for industry to organize itself. When industry organizes itself, then it can engage with government. But so long as we keep going with this, my friend business, and one person getting into whatever, or every day we're hearing the same set of people having the same conversations with the same regulator, this is not like a wholesale business. This is not like where you have 5 telcos that are regulated. You have an entire industry. We need to find a way of getting it back together into single voices, or at least a few voices, engage the government, and then government can then be opened up to us. So citizens first, I think. Yeah.
Citizens first. Fantastic, everybody. This has been a great afternoon. I've learned so much. It's taken me back to some old days in my career, and I've really gotten seen that nothing much has changed. So that's quite interesting too, in terms of regulatory engagement, but it's good that we're seeing this whole broad scope of the ecosystem engaging together, like an industry approach, bottom up, engaging the citizens. Don't just come up with the bill and expect of us to understand in later after the fact. What the NSB is doing is a great thing. Going to the bottom, going to all the stakeholders one by one. You say your point. Do you understand? Do you not understand? What don't you understand? Have we covered you? Have we not covered you? And that would be the way that the bill that's created is holistic. It meets everybody's needs. It's synergistic, and it's also gone back. Let's look at the old bills and policies that already exist and make sure they harmonize. They're not cannibalizing one another or contradicting one another, or not even actionable, as Kazim mentioned, that whole bit of actionability of these bills in terms of we've created it. Now, you, operator, can you use it? Do you understand what we're trying to say? Can you comply with it? That's very important. So increasing the industry government engagement. What I took home from this, it is not a one-off. It's not signing the bill and we stop. It's a continuum. Continuous engagement with the regulator is going to happen between the industry players as an industry as well. So it's constant talking. It's constant, hey, I got to talk to you. Like Kazim said, he'd reach to the private sector. I don't know how to turn on my computer. Tell me how you're doing it in the new way of the way you're doing it. So that is awesome if we can keep this conversation going. And I just believe that The digital first government is going to be critical also. That's another point that I took home in terms of the person you're talking to has to speak your language, has to understand. So building that capacity, the advocacy. So they are an internal advocate. So I took home a term. Someone mentioned something about the activist, oh, it was Benga, the activist regulator, that you've implanted them in the public, the private sector space. They understand, they know the lingo, they know why they're doing this for competitive, profitability, whatever. They understand it. And now they can come back and say, okay, we now as the regulators know why they're doing it. What are the risks and what are we trying to protect in the ecosystem, whether it's consumer protection, whether it's the velocity of money, whatever we're trying to control to make sure that everybody who's in the system is protected and we can now grow. Because without an enabling environment, we've said that startups are growing the economy. If the environment is not conducive for growth, they will pick up and go to Ghana, and where the jollof rice is equally as sweet. So there we go. So let's all just know that we have to make sure that we make an environment where people stay here to invest and grow and scale, because we need the jobs, we need the taxes, we need the startups to be using all the materials in the market, and which will make the economy grow. So thank you all my panelists, Benga, Deze, Chineye, Kazim. We seem to have unfortunately lost Titi this afternoon, and I'm Yewande Adeosi. Everyone have a fantastic afternoon. I'm sorry we went over quite a bit, but I'm sure you enjoyed the conversation. Thank you all.
Thank you, Yewande. And just
Thank
one
you, Yewande.
last thing. I think we've got too many men in the room on the regulator side. I think we need to get more diversity in that space, because all this testosterone doesn't lead us anywhere. We punch each other having conversations, and you did a fantastic job of moderation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Have a good afternoon. Yeah.
Have a good afternoon, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.